Hey everybody, John the Other here, obviously. And I'm going to read you an article that I just wrote, so I hope you enjoy it. Or maybe you won't. Let's go. As most people watching my videos know, this is a MGTOW YouTube channel. And while I talk about a lot of different topics here, MGTOW is sort of the core of my practical approach. Now, the channel has been up on YouTube for a long time, so while I have a few long-term subscribers, I also realize there's new people coming in all the time. So I'm going to cover a little bit of basic MGTOW principle stuff today, just to get everybody up to speed. MGTOW, Men Going Their Own Way, is, in my estimation, not exactly a movement in the sense that its adherents or its practitioners share a philosophy or follow the same leaders or read the same books. I think it's much more accurate to call it a social phenomenon which manifests in response to prevalent social and legal conventions in Western culture, and more locally at a national level in federal, state, and provincial law. Now, these social and legal conventions all share the characteristic that they are dangerous and destructive to men and boys, typically advantageous to women or girls, although often not directly so, sometimes being laws that benefit or enrich government at the cost of harming or endangering men. And MGTOW is a social phenomenon in response to these conditions. It generally takes the form of men making choices in their lives to avoid participation in social and legal institutions in which they are either harmed or put into hazardous or dangerous situations for no benefit. Marriage is arguably the most obvious of these conventions, and it is the growing rejection of marriage by men where the non-MGTOW mainstream has taken the most notice. But as I said before, I don't think MGTOW can properly be described as a movement, notably because the vast number of men taking steps that we might recognize as MGTOW have never heard of the term Men Going Their Own Way or that unwieldy acronym. But having said that, I think there is room for communities within that larger social phenomenon, and one of the places for such communities is here, on YouTube. But again, we have to ask, what is MGTOW? Well, I think it's a lot more than just the marriage strike, or as some authors have called it, men on strike. I think it's a varying and a highly individualistic path of enlightenment and personal development being plotted by men and boys all over the world in rejection of and away from an ever-narrowing and authoritarian mainstream demand for men's conformity and service. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, even as it doesn't explain very much to somebody who is new to the idea. The Western world is becoming more feminist. And despite the bleating and the predictable claims that feminism is just another word for equality, this becoming more feminist means more authoritarian, more intolerant, more censorious, and more narrowly regimented, and all this against a supplied narrative backdrop in which women are the eternal victims and men are their eternal oppressors. It's all very tiresome and predictable. The observable facts that men outnumber women in the workplace fatalities, in homelessness, in suicide, in unemployment, and dying earlier, along with a whole bunch more metrics that are too often mentioned for me to delve into here without this becoming tedious. But men observing these realities are opting out in growing numbers, and while many men may appear to not be doing much with their lives, the modern informational connectedness of the world means that a great many men, rather than just being passive non-participants in broader culture, make their own MGTOW practice one of personal development and growth, absent from and apart from the now mainstream authoritarian demand on men to self-sacrifice on behalf of parasitic organizations or parasitic people. And while certainly not all MGTOW men can be said to be charting such a path of their own personal growth and development, this is a core movement within the larger MGTOW phenomenon ongoing within our wider culture, and this is the part that I find most interesting and exciting. One of the features of the mainstream of our culture that is highly toxic to men, and which a great many men on a MGTOW path will overtly reject, is the popular fashion of fraudulent criminal and sexual accusation, made usually outside the channels of law enforcement or the courts, and used as a tool of social destruction and disposal of inconvenient men. In fact, while much of the public rhetoric in the online MGTOW community addresses women as the offenders and the main users of false accusation, it's not just that some particular woman is an opportunity-grabbing, lying so-and-so with no moral compass. It's that our culture, and both she and you operating within our culture, abets and enables fraudulent criminal accusation. And even after it is resoundingly disproven, thousands of men and women, including a great many journalists and politicians and other public figures, will, hashtag believe in contradiction of evidence because of what I can only call a religious fixation on the mystical idea of feminine virtue and innate innocence, and detached from observable facts and evidence. Now, the rejection of the culture busying itself with the elimination of due process and, presumption of innocence, and now embracing unsubstantiated slander and libels as the main tools of social justice, is a big part of the personal growth aspect of MGTOW, in my opinion. Rejection of all of that. Not only do I find the public's willingness to abandon due process and its civilizing effect to be functionally broken, I find it morally repulsive, and it's something I will have no part of. Now, as many people know, I did not start out on YouTube flying the MGTOW banner. I started out as an MRA, and for a number of years I wrote articles for one of the better-known MRA websites, and being a somewhat independently minded guy, I eventually parted company from that site, philosophically speaking, and parted company practically speaking on not very friendly terms. My viewpoint had evolved to one that was in direct opposition to the site's founder on the matter of MGTOW, and I was refusing at the time to be quiet about it, as the site was promoting a view of MGTOW that I thought was destructive to men who were considering MGTOW as a path for themselves. Now, I'm not mentioning this to reignite that old fight. I consider that question to be a settled one. I'm bringing this up because I want to mention what happened afterwards. One of the senior writers on that site began doing the very thing that now drives so much animosity and distrust towards women within elements of both the men's rights movement and the MGTOW communities. That is the use of false sexual accusation, specifically that of sexual interference with children. Just as women making false accusations tend towards claims of rape and sexual assault, when men use this tactic, it's generally referenced to pedophilia or sexual interference with children, because for each group, whether for women and it's rape, or men and child rape, it is the ultimate and supreme most despicable thing you can possibly accuse anybody of. It's the ultimate moral crime. And in its use as an accusation, it is the ultimate nuclear weapon to destroy a person's social standing. When women use this tactic, it's obviously despicable, it's unforgivable, it's depraved. And when men in blue pill culture throw in with this, they pile on in the form of, hashtag believe, or any other abrogation of due process, or the basic principles of decency such as evidence, motherfucker, or get the hell out, then those men are disgusting cretins who clearly stink of opportunism and amoral cowardice. And when somebody calling themselves, an MRA personally initiates a specious or a fraudulent accusation of sexual misconduct or sexual assault or rape or child rape, well, then I honestly don't know if there is strong enough language to express my disgust. So when I heard this vile garbage coming from the mouths of people I used to work with in the men's rights part of the manosphere, I actually felt a lot better about having no further part of their business. The philosophical divide that had grown between myself and my former colleagues seemed almost like a firewall against my possible infection by whatever sickness had infected their minds. So imagine my surprise, my utter amazement, when I saw this exact same tactic being used by a member of the YouTube MGTOW community. Now, in my last video, the one about New Year's resolutions, I talked briefly about maintaining a list of rules, and that the purpose of such a list was to help men shedding the dysfunctional and the toxic elements of our mainstream culture, and helping those men to recognize conduct or behavior or social conventions that they wanted no part of. In the comments of that video, one particularly astute commenter asked if I had read a book which describes a set of rules serving a similar purpose to my proposed list. The book is called The 4 Agreements, and it states in its description that adopting and committing to these agreements is very simple, but actually living them and keeping these 4 agreements can be one of the hardest things you ever do, as well as one of the most life-changing things you could ever do. Now, if you'd like to save yourself the price of that book, it's summarized online, and I'll put a link to that in the low bar. But I'm going to read you just the 4 agreements in summary, in reverse order, from the last one to the first. Number 4 is, always do your best. This is going to change from moment to moment. It will be different when you are healthy as opposed to when you're sick. It will be different when you're tired than when you're, fresh. Under any circumstance, simply do your best, and you will avoid self-judgment, self-abuse, and regret. That's number 4. It's a pretty good rule. Number 3, don't make assumptions. Find the courage to ask questions and express what you really want. Communicate with others as clearly as you can, and avoid misunderstandings, avoid sadness, and avoid drama. With this one agreement, you can completely transform your life. These are really good agreements. Number 2, the second item in the list. Don't take anything personally. Nothing that other people do is because of you. What others say and do is a projection of their own reality, their own dreams. When you are immune to the opinions and the actions of others, you will not be the victim of needless suffering. This seems all very metaphysical, but these are highly practical rules. I like them a lot. And number 1, the first of the 4 rules, or the 4 agreements, the title of the book, be impeccable with your word. Speak with integrity. Say only what you mean. Avoid using the word, your word, to speak against yourself or to gossip about others. Use the power of your word in the direction of truth and compassion. Okay, I changed that one a little bit. They said truth and love. I don't believe in love, so I think compassion is better. But, you get the idea. Anyway, this is a book called The 4 Agreements, and I have ordered it on Amazon. I recommend you do the same if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Now, the YouTuber who mentioned this book, remember, we're talking about my last video, the list of rules for yourself. The YouTuber who mentioned this book also said the following. He said, when I started applying these agreements to other people, in other words, kicking them to the curb if they violated these simple civil behavioral requirements, my life took a complete 180 degrees turn for the better. You know what? I'm going to add these to my personal list as well. Thanks very much for listening, and as always, have a lovely day.